Okay, we're back. Big surprise. And this is where we left off in our last video about photosynthesis and respiration. We're talking about the formula for photosynthesis. Really all that means is, hey, what is going into this reaction and what is coming out? And we just write it as a chemical formula, which means we don't use the words, we use the chemical symbols that represent those words. So we know we have to think that what goes on, sorry, my thing is inverted. What goes on the left side of the formula is what goes in, then an arrow, and what comes out goes on the right side of the formula. So let's think about what goes into a plant. They take in water through their roots. They take in CO2 through the stomata and the leaves. They're like little mouths, little openings at the bottom of a leaf where they breathe in, where they take in CO2. And then what does the plant make? It makes oxygen and sugar or glucose. So the formula looks like this. This is a balanced formula. It takes 6 molecules of CO2. So a big number at the beginning of a formula tells you how many molecules you have. So this is just saying we have 6 molecules of CO2. Maybe you remember that from balancing chemical equations. There's plenty of different resources online that can show you how to balance a chemical equation or how it's done. And if there's a little number after the letter, after the element symbol, that says that's how many of those atoms are in that molecule. So CO2 has 1 carbon and 2 oxygens in it. And the 6 just tells us there are 6 of these CO2 molecules. Okay, so we've balanced this. Well, what does that mean? Let's take a look here. So we have 6 CO2 and 6 waters makes 6 oxygen and 1 glucose. Well, why not 6? Everything else was 6. Why does that only get 1? Well, we have to balance how many of each element is on each side of the equation. Kind of like if you have to balance a math problem, you want to have the same on both sides. So if you look here, we have CO2. So let's just start with that. We have a C. We have O2. The 6 tells us how many of those carbon dioxides are there. There's 6. So we have 6 carbons and 6. We don't have 6 oxygens. We have to multiply by this little number. 6 times 2. There's 12 oxygens. Why? Because we multiply this number 6 by everything that's here. Well, there's no number here. Shouldn't that be 0? It's 1. They just don't write a 1. Why? It saves space and time, I guess. So on this side of the equation, we have 6 carbons, 12 oxygens. Look here, we have more oxygens. So let's just look at carbon for now. We have 6 carbon. How many carbons do we have on this side? 6. Okay, so the carbons are balanced. We want each element, the C, the H, and the O in this case, to be balanced on the formula. So that's why we have those numbers there. It helps us to balance the equation. So that's the correct balanced equation for photosynthesis. Guess what? It's going to be familiar when we hear about respiration. Okay, so now that we know about balancing that, let's take a look at this. It says if 18 carbon dioxide molecules are used, how many glucose sugar molecules are created? So let's think back to this formula. They're telling us that they want us to use 18 instead of 6. What could we do to 6 to get to the number 18? We could multiply by 3. Okay. Think about math in math class. If you multiply one side or one thing by 3, is that the only thing you have to multiply, or do you have to do the same thing to both sides? You have to do the same thing to both sides. So if we have to multiply by 3 to get to 18, then we're going to have to multiply everything else in this formula by 3 to get to 18. So that will give us 18 waters, 18 oxygen, and 3 sugars. How did you know that? Well, remember, if you have, like, in math class, if you have x, that's like writing 1x, but we usually don't write the 1. So in front of the glucose, there's like an invisible 1 there. So if we multiply 1 by 3, we end up with 3. So how many sugar molecules are created? 3. That's how we find that out. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about respiration. What is it? Where does it happen? What's ATP? What goes in? What comes out? Are there different types? What does these different types of respiration? Let's find out. So what is respiration and where does it happen? Respiration is kind of the opposite of photosynthesis. It's taking sugar and turning that into usable energy. Photosynthesis, you take sunlight, water, and energy from the sun, and we turn that into food. So this is the opposite. This is turning food into energy. So where does it happen? Mostly in the mitochondria. It can also happen right in the cytoplasm. Shock. Okay, some of it does happen in the cytoplasm, even though, as you all know, prereq to graduate high school, you should know mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And that means it's the organelle that's used to make ATP energy. So let's learn about the mitochondria. It's a fun organelle. A lot of times it looks like a jelly bean with lines in it. I've had people call this like a house shoe, like a wave pool, like a lazy river. They're like it's a potato pool. What does it look like to you? I'd love to know because I've heard everything. So most of your body's energy is made in the mitochondria. And the inside of the mitochondria, like you can see in this picture, is very folded. It's all like kind of got all these like little wrinkly layers. It's folded inside. The more folded it is, the more energy it can make because energy gets made in these little areas. The most energy gets made right on the little line, the fold. So the more folds, the more energy. Okay. It takes a big molecule, sugar. Glucose is a large molecule, and it breaks it into small pieces. And when you break a molecule, you make energy. When you build a molecule, it takes energy. So what's respiration? It's the process of making ATP energy. There are 3 parts for us making ATP energy. We're not going to go into detail. You don't need to go into detail. If you take a more advanced class or you'd like to learn about it in college or you want to be a nurse, you're going to need to know these in greater detail, but today you don't. So what types of respiration are there? Well, many things need oxygen to survive and to make energy. That's why you need oxygen. You need it to make energy. So that's why you're breathing, so you can make energy. That's called aerobic cellular respiration. I don't have editing. Aerobic cellular respiration. Okay, aerobic means with oxygen. There are 3 parts to that. You don't need to know details about them, but you should know what they are. They're called glycolysis, Krebs cycle. Now it's called the citric acid cycle, but I learned it as the Krebs cycle. So maybe you should hear it as both. Krebs cycle, citric acid cycle. And the last one is electron transport chain. So what happens in each of those is like a summary. In glycolysis, that happens in the cytoplasm, not the mitochondria. And 2 ATP are made. Okay, fair. Then you have the citric acid cycle, also called the Krebs cycle. That happens in the mitochondria, and 2 more ATP are made. All right. Then we have the electron transport chain that happens in the folds of the mitochondria, and that makes 34 ATP. That's a lot. So that part makes the most ATP energy. And that's where you need the oxygen to come in. So you can make a lot of energy with aerobic cellular respiration. So what are the reactants? What goes in? Well, what do you breathe in? What do you take in? Oxygen. And then if you wanted to make a little kid hyper and give them lots of energy, what would you give them? Sugar. So the reactants for aerobic cellular respiration are oxygen and glucose. What are the products? So what do you make? What did we just say gets made? Right here. It's on here. It's right there. It's ATP. Okay, so we make ATP energy. We make ATP energy. What do you breathe out? Carbon dioxide. And then everybody was you know how people always say, oh, so-and-so, your hot breath on the window. That fog is water. What makes fog? Water. So the products of aerobic cellular respiration are ATP energy, carbon dioxide, and water. It's literally the opposite of photosynthesis. Like just take the photosynthesis and formula and flip it around. It's the opposite. Okay, it occurs in the mitochondria. What about things that don't need oxygen? Don't say fish. Fish need oxygen. They pull oxygen out of the water. There's dissolved oxygen in the water around them. We're talking about things like bacteria. For